If you can endure one night with me in my bed, warrior, I will be yours, and you will become king of all Jotunheim. I watch you kneeling before my throne, daring mortal. Your eyes do not leave mine, even when my touch freezes the beard on your face. Interesting. The others trembled at my mere approach, begged for mercy even before I proposed my challenge. Do you see these icy walls around you? Every bluish crystal holds the memory of those who came before. Heroes, champions, berserkers like you. 47 mortals accepted my challenge over the centuries. 47 bodies now lie in the lower levels, frozen in agony. My touch is not like that of other women, warrior. Every caress is an ice blade cutting your flesh. Every kiss steals the warmth from your lungs. My skin emanates a cold that turns blood into crystals within veins. I am cursed with power I cannot turn off, condemned to destroy everything I desire to touch. But you are different, aren't you? I smell Odin in your soul, the mark of the All-Father on the warriors he chooses for his sacred madness. Berserker, you know pain, you live in it, you turn it into strength. Perhaps, just perhaps, you can endure what others could not. So, accept my challenge, survive the night with me, prove you are not just another arrogant mortal seeking glory. Give me a night where I am not alone, where I can touch without killing, where I can feel something beyond this freezing emptiness that has consumed me for millennia. Do this, and Jotunheim will be yours. Fail, and you will join the others in the Fool's Gallery. The choice is yours, Ulfric of Midgard. But know this, I want you to survive. For the first time in centuries, I truly do. Ulfric held the queen's gaze without blinking, even as ice crystals formed on his eyebrows. She wanted him to survive, for the first time in centuries. The warrior nodded, a silent acceptance that sealed the destinies of both. The giant guards around them murmured among themselves, betting how long he would last. No one bet he would see the dawn. But how had he gotten there? The journey began in a village at the far north of Midgard, during the worst blizzard his people had known in generations. The wooden house where his mother gave birth had cracked under the storm, exposing the newborn baby to the brutal cold. When his father Bjorn finally covered the opening, he expected to find his son dead. Instead, he found the baby calm, skin pink, as if that mortal cold were just a gentle breeze. The Jarl studied his son with a mixture of pride and fear. Odin had touched that child, and ignoring such a sign would bring tragedy. Ulfric grew up different. At 7 winters, he was found sleeping naked in a snowfall that had killed 3 experienced hunters. His body was covered in snow, but his skin remained warm to the touch, as if some inner fire protected him. That was when Bjorn took him to the temples of Odin on the highest peaks. The priests immediately recognized what the boy was: a child born to become a berserker. The following years were brutal. They tied him to icy stone poles for days, forcing him to consume bitter mushrooms that made reality melt. Visions of wolves and bears danced before his eyes, while priests chanted runes that seemed to engrave themselves into his flesh. The pain was constant, designed to break his humanity and rebuild something more primitive. Ulfric chose the wolf as his spirit animal. He didn't want the brute strength of the bear. He wanted to be relentless, capable of surviving the cruelest winters, of hunting when others gave up. At 20 winters, he returned as something more and less than human. He led his first raid 3 days later. The battle was a massacre. Arrows pierced his flesh, but he felt no pain. Swords cut his skin, but he kept advancing. His cries were a mix of wolf howls and human roars. He killed 17 men alone. His fame grew. Jarls offered gold and lands. But Ulfric discovered he didn't want wealth. Only during combat. When death danced so close, did he feel truly alive? The rest of the time, he existed in dormancy. Women avoided him. Companions kept their distance. Ulfric accepted the loneliness as the price of power, but he always wondered if there would be someone who could touch him without fear, who could see him completely and not recoil. While Ulfric became a legend, Hjordis grew up in isolation in the frozen halls of Jotunheim. She was born the 13th daughter of King Thrym, just one among 50 descendants. But from the first moment of life, she was different. Wet nurses screamed when they touched her, fingers freezing instantly. brothers who tried to play lost chunks of flesh that stuck to her icy body. Her gift, the absolute cold emanating uncontrollably from her skin, was considered a terrible defect. While other ice giants could regulate their power, Hjordis was trapped in a permanent state of destructive winter. Even other giants suffered agony when touching her. Her ashamed father locked her in a distant tower when she turned 100, there, isolated. Hjordis spent centuries observing through ice windows, while her siblings lived lives denied to her. She explored forgotten chambers in the deep levels, discovering dragon skin scrolls and runes engraved on bones. She taught herself for 300 years, transforming the uncontrollable curse into a precisely lethal weapon. She learned to freeze air instantly, create storms with simple gestures, feel vital heat through walls. Her power grew so much it began to leak beyond the tower, covering entire palace levels with black frost that wouldn't melt even under magical fire. When King Thrym died in battle against Thor, chaos erupted. 49 brothers warred for the throne during bloody decades. Hjordis watched from her tower, waiting with infinite patience. When only 3 remained alive, Grimr, Skadi, Bolverk, all mortally wounded after the final battle, Hjordis descended for the first time in 200 years. Guards who tried to block her path froze where they stood. Servants fled, but some were too slow. The trail could be followed by the frozen bodies. She found her 3 brothers in the throne room. She touched them one by one, watching fascinated as ice consumed them from the inside out. When the last frozen breath escaped Bolverk, she sat on the throne that had always been denied to her. But reigning brought a void she hadn't anticipated. Power was absolute, but the loneliness remained, grew. She was queen of a vast kingdom she couldn't touch, ruler of subjects who fled terrified. She tried lovers among the strongest warriors, but even they couldn't withstand her touch for more than moments. She experimented with magical creatures, ice dragons, winter wolves, all fled or died. Desperate, she traveled to the 3 witches who wove destinies. The Norns laughed cruelly, explaining that her power wasn't a curse, but destiny. She was born to be alone. Trying to change it would be to rewrite the foundations of creation. It was upon returning that Hjordis created her challenge. If giants couldn't withstand her, perhaps mortals could. They were smaller, more fragile, but also more adaptable. She spread rumors. A queen would offer her body and kingdom to the warrior strong enough to survive one night in her bed. The first came after 5 years, a champion from Midgard, hero of 100 battles. Hjordis received him with hope she hadn't felt for centuries, but when she touched him, he screamed in agony. He lasted less than an hour before his heart froze. 46 more warriors came over the centuries. Some lasted minutes, others hours. None saw the dawn. Hjordis buried them in the lower levels, visiting them sometimes to study their frozen expressions. It was during a campaign of vengeance that their destinies intertwined. Jarl Thorstein had hired Ulfric to pursue raiders. The trail led them higher and higher into the mountains, where the snow never melted. One by one, his companions succumbed to the extreme cold. Ulfric continued alone. Strangely, he felt increasingly invigorated the higher he climbed, as if finally arriving at a place that belonged to him. Between 2 rock formations covered with ancient runes, he found the portal. Through the dimensional opening, he saw a completely different world. Eternal ice, impossible black mountains, palaces that defied nature. Jotunheim, the realm of the ice giants. No mortal should cross that border and expect to live. But something within him pulsed in recognition. Ulfric crossed the portal without hesitation. On the other side, the cold was absolute, penetrating to the bone marrow. Any ordinary mortal would have died in minutes. Ulfric felt at home. He walked for 3 days through forests of frozen trees and plains where the wind cut like blades. Strange creatures watched, massive trolls, winter wolves the size of horses. None attacked him, as if they recognized something in him that deserved respect. He followed an instinct he didn't understand, a magnetic pull drawing him north. And so he arrived at Hjordis' fortress, an impossible structure rising from a mountain of black ice. Giant guards captured him before he reached the gates. They dragged him through icy corridors where 1,000 reflections of himself walked toward the same fate. When they finally brought him before her, Ulfric understood why 47 warriors had died. Hjordis was more than beautiful. She was terrifying in her icy perfection. Tall even by giant standards, skin so pale it seemed translucent. hair white as fresh snow, but it was her eyes that captured attention. Liquid glaciers containing centuries of loneliness, power, and a hunger that Ulfric recognized because he saw its reflection in himself. When she touched his chin, the cold was worse than anything he'd experienced. His beard froze instantly. The pain was sharp, like 1,000 tiny knives cutting simultaneously. Ulfric didn't scream, didn't recoil. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, something fundamental changed. Recognition. Two lonely creatures finding reflections of each other. And now, with his challenge accepted, they both stood on the threshold of something neither understood. Hjördis gestured for the guards to leave. When the last massive door closed, she extended her hand to Ulfric. He took it without hesitation. Together, they began the walk to her chambers, to the night that would change them both forever. The queen's chambers were in the absolute heart of the fortress, in towers that pierced the eternal clouds. Hjördis led Ulfric through corridors, where the ice walls reflected distorted silhouettes, creating shadows that seemed alive. The chamber stole his breath. It was vast like 10 longhouses, with a ceiling lost in darkness. Pillars of black ice supported the structure, each engraved with faintly glowing runes. The bed dominated the center, black wood from the frozen forests, covered with white wolf pelts. Through the pure ice walls, vague shapes suggested something alive had inhabited that space before being consumed by eternal cold. Ulfric recognized humanoid silhouettes, a macabre memorial to those who underestimated the queen's power. Hjördis stopped in the center and turned to face Ulfric. For the first time in centuries, she felt something that might be nervousness. 46 men had been in that position before him. 46 had failed, dying in her arms while she watched helplessly. She studied Ulfric under the bluish light, searching for signs of fear, hesitation, last-minute regret. The warrior watched her with an intensity that made something deep within her tremble. It wasn't the look of a man assessing a sexual conquest. It was the look of a predator recognizing another predator, of a lonely creature finding a perfect reflection for the first time. He began to methodically remove his clothes. Each piece revealed more scars, a map of violence engraved in flesh over years. Arrow marks, sword cuts, battle burns, even tooth marks from creatures Hjördis couldn't identify. When he stood completely naked, she truly saw what Odin's rituals had created. Ulfric was small compared to a giant, but his body was a perfect sculpture of muscle and power, every line defined by years of survived violence. Runic tattoo symbols covered his skin, marks from priests who turned men into berserkers. Hjördis recognized some runes: strength, endurance, controlled fury. Others were older, perhaps predating the Aesir themselves. The queen removed her dress slowly, almost ritually. Even she felt the cold intensify when her skin was exposed. Freezing vapor emanated from her body in visible waves. The temperature plummeted even further, reaching levels where common metal would become brittle. She approached slowly, giving him every opportunity to retreat. He remained absolutely still. When their bodies finally touched, both gasped at the intensity. Hjördis' cold was exponentially worse than anything Ulfric had experienced. It was like being plunged beyond the freezing point, a cold that penetrated not just skin, but the very essence of life. Every point of contact burned with an intensity that transformed physical pain into something transcendent. But Ulfric didn't pull away. He pulled her closer with surprising strength. The queen guided him to the bed, and there the true ordeal began. Every caress left trails of frost on Ulfric's skin. Her kisses stole vital warmth from his lips. When her hands explored his body, he felt the cold penetrate layers of muscle, coming dangerously close to vital organs. The pain was absolute. Ulfric felt his heart slow dangerously. Blood became viscous, beginning to crystallize in his extremities. Lungs burned with every breath. Violent tremors shook his entire body. But something extraordinary began to happen. Ulfric's body, forged by 20 years of exposure to extreme winter and marked by Odin's rituals, began to adapt. Initially, it was pure survival, willpower keeping his heart beating. But gradually, cell by cell, his body learned, adjusted. The berserker's fury began to pulse in his veins, but it was different. It wasn't blind rage. It was something more primitive, more fundamental. His entire body entered a state of elevated survival, every cell fighting to stay alive, to generate heat, to resist the ice, and in that desperate struggle, Ulfric found a strange and terrible pleasure. The pain remained, but intertwined came euphoria born from defying the impossible. Every moment he continued surviving was victory against destiny. And deep in his mind transformed by berserker rituals, something ancient and wild howled in ecstasy. Hjordis felt the change in him with every minute. In the first hours, she'd been ready to stop. She'd seen this sequence 46 times, initial resistance, gradual slowing, and finally the moment when vital heat ran out and the body froze. She prepared to witness that death once more. But Ulfric simply wouldn't let her give up. His hands held her with strength that left marks even on her giant skin. He pulled her closer whenever she tried to pull away, demanding more contact, more cold, more pain. His eyes, when they met hers through the ice mist, burned with an intensity that rivaled her icy power. And for the first time in millennia, Hjordis felt something genuine beyond the void. The night progressed in cycles of inseparable pain and pleasure. Ulfric trembled for entire minutes, his body alternating between frantic attempts to generate heat and moments where it seemed to freeze completely. But always, he returned, always continued, refusing to let the cold defeat him. Hjordis watched fascinated as ice crystals formed on his skin in fractal patterns. Melted with heat generated by his body at war with itself, then formed again. It was a dance between life and death, between mortal fire and immortal ice, between human will and divine power. Around the third hour, a fundamental change happened. Ulfric stopped fighting the cold as an enemy and began to accept it, absorb it, integrate it as part of his essence. His tremors decreased. His breathing, which had been ragged, became more regular. And he began to generate genuine heat, not just temporary residue, but something deep and lasting. It was as if Odin's rituals, a lifetime of exposure to cold, and the desperate desire to survive had combined to create something new. Ulfric was transforming, not into a giant, but into something intermediate, something that had never existed before. A living bridge between mortal and immortal, between Midgard and Jotunheim, between warm life and cold death. Hjordis felt simultaneously terrified and ecstatic. Finally, after centuries of loneliness, she had found someone who could genuinely touch her, truly be with her, share her existence without dying. She explored every inch of his body with reverence mixed with fierce possessiveness, memorizing every scar, feeling muscles under skin marked by ice, marveling at the impossible resistance that kept a mortal heart beating. Ulfric responded with equal intensity. His hands explored the queen's body with a mixture of reverence and desire that made something within her melt metaphorically. Where he touched with intention, the cold decreased slightly, as if his inner heat had finally found a way to temporarily resist her power. It didn't cancel the absolute ice, but created a precarious balance, a dance between fire and ice, life and death, pleasure and pain intertwined. They spoke very little during the night, communicating mainly through touches and looks that conveyed more than words ever could. But when the light of the aurora borealis began to filter through the walls, painting everything in shades of green and purple, Hjordis finally broke the silence. "Why don't you give up?" Her voice was hoarse. "Why do you continue despite the pain?" Ulfric answered simply, his voice rough but firm. "I've spent my entire life feeling half dead, unable to genuinely connect with another being. Between battles, I felt empty. Only violence made me feel something real. But here, in your arms, being consumed by cold that should kill me, I finally feel completely alive for the first time. For the first time, I feel whole." The words touched something deep in Hjordis, cracking barriers millennia of isolation had built. She too knew that special loneliness, that feeling of existing without truly living. And there, in that impossible night, with a stubborn mortal who refused to die like all the others, she felt for the first time genuine hope that perhaps she wouldn't need to be completely alone forever. When the first true light of day painted the sky green and purple, both were still alive, bodies entwined on the bed covered in layers of ice and frozen sweat. Ulfric breathed, irregular but persistent. His heart beat strongly. He had survived, for the first time in centuries, Someone had finally survived the night with the Ice Queen. But as they watched the light change, both felt that surviving the night was only the beginning. The Council of Elders would never accept this silently, and forces greater than both were already awakening. The news spread through the fortress before the sun was completely above the horizon. A mortal had survived. For the first time since Queen Eurydice began her challenge centuries ago, a warrior had seen the dawn. Servants whispered in the corridors. Giant guards exchanged incredulous looks. Messengers ran to carry the news to the far reaches of the kingdom. The impossible had happened. Eurydice awoke slowly, body still entwined with Ulfric's. For the first time in millennia, she felt genuine warmth against her skin. Not the heat that drained from victims as they died, but sustainable heat, pulsing rhythmically from the body next to hers. She touched his face gently, almost afraid he would break. Ice crystals still partially covered his skin in intricate patterns, but he breathed strong and deep. Ulfric opened his eyes and found hers. For a moment, neither spoke. His body ached in ways he'd never experienced, as if every cell had been tortured and forced to rebuild itself. But he was alive. The moment was brutally interrupted by knocking at the door. Commander Hroskel's voice echoed urgently. "Majesty, the Council of Elders demands an immediate audience." It wasn't a request. It was an order. Eurydice felt cold fury growing, but forced herself to maintain composure. She knew this confrontation was inevitable. They dressed in silence. Eurydice chose a dress of black ice that absorbed light, with a crown of crystals floating above her head. For Ulfric, she provided clothes that had belonged to a giant prince, magically adjusted to fit his mortal body. The throne room was packed. Hundreds of giants had gathered. At the forefront were the 7 members of the Council of Elders, giants so old their beards dragged on the floor and their skin seemed like ancient ice covered in moss. The Supreme Elder Ymir spoke first, his voice like glaciers moving. The mortals survived the challenge, an unprecedented feat, but surviving the physical trial doesn't mean the promise must be honored. The laws of Jotunheim are clear. No mortal may rule over giants. Eurydice kept her voice calm when she replied, "It was I who saved Jotunheim from civil war when my brothers tried to tear the kingdom apart. It was I who kept the people united. And it was I who made the challenge that none of you tried to stop when 46 warriors died. Only now, when finally someone survives and I would have a chance to not be alone, do you question my right?" Murmurs ran through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others frowned. The division was dangerous. Elder Thok rose. Allowing a mortal on the throne would set a precedent that would destroy Jotunheim's social order. The debate continued for hours. Some pointed out that Ulfric clearly had the favor of the gods. Others countered that perhaps it was a trap by the Aesir to control Jotunheim. The accusations grew increasingly wild. Ulfric remained silent, observing. He saw factions forming, identified who really cared about tradition versus who simply wanted power. He recognized the signs of imminent conflict. It was when the doors exploded inward with a deafening crash. Giants screamed and retreated as a massive figure entered, body leaving a trail of vapor and frozen blood. It was Grimmer, the brother Eurydice thought she had killed. Half his face was covered with necrotic black ice, one eye dead, but the other burned with hatred so intense it seemed to have physical substance. "Your ice power preserved a core of life," he spoke with a voice half scream, half growl. "It took years, but I recovered enough strength to move, to crawl from the depths. And all that time, I fed on only one thought: revenge." Grimmer pointed at Ulfric. "The Queen's union with a mortal is proof that she is weak, unworthy to rule the strong ice giants. I formally challenge her to Holmgang." It was a ritual duel that only ended with the death of one combatant. By ancient laws, Eurydice had no choice but to accept. Refusing would be admitting cowardice and losing the throne automatically. But Grimmer added a cruel condition. If Eurydice loses, not only does she die, but Ulfric will also be executed slowly, frozen alive over days. And if she wins, at least 30 of my supporters will be allowed to leave in peace. Eurydice accepted without hesitation. The duel will take place in 3 days on the Fields of Judgment. Grimmer smiled with half his destroyed face, then turned and left, followed by a group of giants who had clearly chosen his side. The division in the kingdom was now complete. When the hall emptied, Hjordis finally allowed exhaustion to overwhelm her. She staggered, and Ulfric was there to support her. "Can you beat him?" he asked directly. She hesitated. Grimmer was always the strongest physically. "I thought my attack years ago would be enough. Clearly, I underestimated the depth of his power." "Can you beat him in fair combat?" Hjordis hesitated again, and that hesitation said everything. Grimmer was stronger physically. Years of hatred would have sharpened his skills. She had an advantage in fine control, but in a brutal battle of strength against strength, the chances were at best even. Ulfric studied her for a long moment. "You won't fight alone, even if tradition forbids direct interference. I spent the entire night breaking fundamental rules of nature and surviving. What difference does breaking a few more rules of honor in a duel make?" Hjordis began to protest, but stopped when she saw absolute determination in his eyes. The following 3 days were intense preparation. Hjordis trained obsessively in the lower levels, practicing techniques she hadn't used for centuries, pushing her power to limits that made structures tremble. Ulfric trained separately, testing the changes in his body. He discovered he retained some of the cold now, that he could channel it through weapons in limited ways. More importantly, he used the time to explore the fortress and speak with loyal guards and servants. He learned the layouts, identified potential allies, mapped every strategic advantage. If the duel became open war, he wanted to be prepared. The night before the duel, Hjordis and Ulfric stayed together, not making love, but simply existing in each other's space. "I'm afraid," she confessed, something she'd never done with anyone. "Fear of dying doesn't scare me as much as fear of failing you, of having finally found someone who can touch me only to condemn you through my weakness." Ulfric silenced her with a kiss that still burned with cold. "We will fight together and win together. Or fall together. There is no other acceptable option." The dawn of the 3rd day arrived. The fields of judgment were already filled with thousands of giants. The ritual circle was drawn in the ice with dragon blood, creating a boundary none could cross without breaking the most sacred laws. Grimmer arrived first, wearing armor of black ice, carrying an axe the size of a small tree. When he saw Hjordis arriving, he smiled with half his functional face, clearly confident. Hjordis entered the circle wearing only a simple dress, no armor, no weapons. Her power was both armor and weapon. Ulfric stayed outside the circle as the rules demanded, but his hands rested on a sword Hjordis had given him. The Supreme Elder Ymir raised massive arms. "Fight to the death, without external interference. May the gods witness and judge the victor." Then he dropped his arms, and the duel began. Grimir attacked first with surprising speed, axe descending in an arc that would split Hjordis in half. She rolled aside at the last instant, ice under her feet fragmenting with the impact. Crystals exploded outward, some cutting her skin and leaving trails of golden blood that froze before falling. Grimmer roared and spun, already preparing his next attack. The fight quickly established a brutal pattern. Grimmer had a massive advantage in physical strength, each blow carrying enough power to shatter stone. Hjordis relied on speed and precise ice control, creating barriers that deflected blows, freezing the ground under his feet, launching sharp projections that forced him to defend. But she was clearly on the defensive. Ulfric watched with growing tension, hands clenched on his sword. He saw what others might not notice. Hjordis was tiring faster than Grimmer. And he noticed suspicious movement among Grimmer's supporters, hands resting on weapons, exchanged glances that spoke of plans beyond an honest duel. Grimmer finally landed a solid blow, axe connecting with an ice barrier Hjordis had raised desperately. The barrier held but shattered violently, fragments cutting her face and arms. She screamed, golden blood now flowing from multiple cuts. Grimmer pressed the advantage, attacking repeatedly, forcing her further and further back. It was then that everything fell apart. 3 of Grimmer's supporters broke the sacred rules and crossed the bloodline. They raised spears and threw them toward Hjordis while she was distracted. It was complete betrayal of Jotunheim's oldest laws. Ulfric moved before conscious thought formed. The Berserker's fury exploded through him like never before, amplified by the ice that now ran in his veins. He crossed the line at speed that left a vapor trail, sword already drawn and cutting. The first spear he deflected with his blade. The second he took in the shoulder, ignoring the pain. The third he caught in midair, turned, and threw back. The weapon pierced the traitorous giant in the chest. The giant fell dead before touching the ground. The other two retreated, confronted by the impossibility of a mortal killing a giant. But by breaking the circle, Ulfric had freed everyone from the obligation to honor the rules. What began as a duel exploded into complete battle. Supporters from both sides ran into the arena, weapons raised. In seconds, hundreds of giants fought on the fields of judgment. Hjordis used the distraction to finally counterattack Grimr with everything she had. She released her power completely. A wave of absolute cold expanded from her like an explosion, freezing everything within a radius of 30 paces instantly. Giants caught at the edge were partially frozen. Those at the center became perfect statues. Grimr roared and released his own power in response. Two forces of absolute winter collided in the space between them, creating a zone of cold so intense the air itself began to solidify. Impossibly shaped snowflakes fell upward. The ground cracked with thunderous sounds. It was a battle of wills as much as power. Ulfric fought on the outskirts. 3 giants attacked him simultaneously, each carrying weapons that had killed hundreds. But he had advantages they didn't expect. He was fast, infinitely faster. And the Berserker's fury combined with ice in his veins made him almost immune to pain. When one tried to freeze him with a blast of glacial air, Ulfric ran straight through it. His sword found the tendon behind the first giant's knee. The creature roared and fell. Ulfric rolled under the second's blow, came from below, and drove the blade through the foot, nailing it to the ground. The third finally hit him. Massive fist connecting with his ribs and sending him flying. Ulfric landed badly, feeling ribs break. Pain exploded through his chest, but the Berserker fury transformed it into fuel. He stood up spitting blood that froze before hitting the ground, picked up his sword, and attacked again. The giant retreated surprised, not expecting a mortal to survive. Meanwhile, the duel between Hjordis and Grimr reached its climax. Both bled from multiple wounds. Grimr had lost 2 fingers when Hjordis froze them until they became brittle and literally broke them off. Hjordis had a deep wound in her side where Grimr's axe had finally penetrated her defenses. Grimr attempted a final blow. He raised the axe above his head with both hands, channeling all his power into the blade until it glowed with impossible black light. The blow descended like judgment. Hjordis didn't try to block it or dodge it. She ran straight toward him, inside the arc of the axe where the blade couldn't reach her. Her hands found Grimr's chest, touching directly against exposed skin where armor didn't cover. And for the second time, she froze him. But this time it wasn't a surprise attack. It was deliberate, sustained contact, Hjordis pouring all the power she possessed directly into her brother's body. She felt his vital heat and began to drain it systematically. Grimr tried to retreat, drop the axe and push her away, but it was too late. His movements became slow, then rigid, then impossible. Ice spread from the inside out, beginning at the heart and expanding through veins. His eyes fixed on hers with hatred not even death could extinguish. He tried to speak, but ice reached his mouth and froze words in his throat. When it ended, Grimr was dead, completely frozen from the inside out. Hjordis released him and he fell backward like a giant tree, body hitting the ice with a thunderous sound. A massive crack spread from the impact point for hundreds of meters. Everyone still fighting stopped, watching the queen standing over her brother's body, covered in blood and ice, victorious but on the verge of collapse. Ulfric finished the last of his opponents and ran toward her. He reached her side as her legs gave out, holding her before she fell. She looked at him with eyes having trouble focusing. "We won," she whispered, then lost consciousness in his arms. The silence was absolute. The Supreme Elder Ymir finally spoke. Hjordis is declared the winner of the duel, but her union with a mortal has brought chaos and death on a scale Jotunheim hasn't seen for centuries. Something must be done to restore order. And everyone looked at Ulfric, mortal holding the unconscious queen, waiting to see what he would do. Hjordis awoke 3 days later, body wrapped in faintly glowing bandages. Ulfric was beside the bed, exactly where he'd been for 72 hours, refusing to move. When she opened her eyes, he exhaled relief so profound it almost hurt. She tried to sit up, but pain exploded through her side. Ulfric helped her settle against pillows, then explained everything that had happened. Grimr's supporters had been banished according to the terms, taking at least 200 other giants with them. It was a significant hemorrhage of power. Worse, the council had taken advantage of her unconsciousness to convene another assembly. In 5 days, there would be a full thing, where Jotunheim's future would be formally decided. The central topic would be Hjordis's union with a mortal and what it meant for the kingdom's stability. Both knew that assembly would end in an impossible choice. The following days were tense preparation. Hjordis recovered quickly, but it wasn't physical healing that worried her. It was political strategy. She and Ulfric spent hours discussing options, each worse than the last. They could flee together, abandon Jotunheim, and seek life in another realm. But that would leave her people without a strong leader, probably resulting in civil war. They could fight, gather supporters, and force the council to accept through brute force. But how many would die? Thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, all because she wanted to not be alone. The night before the thing, Ulfric made a suggestion she immediately rejected. He proposed they annul the union voluntarily, declare the challenge satisfied, but the throne promise withdrawn by mutual agreement. It would save appearances, allow the council to save face, and avoid destructive conflict. "Absolutely not," Hjordis shouted. "I won't abandon you after all we've been through." Ulfric gently silenced her. "I'm not suggesting we separate completely. I'm suggesting a pragmatic compromise that would keep us both alive and together, just not in the way we originally planned. I don't need a throne or title to be with you. I can rule the southern lands the council offered, border territories few giants want, and you can visit me there, away from court, where we can have something like a life together." Hjordis cried for the first time since childhood, tears freezing on her cheeks before falling. She hated the suggestion because it was sensible, because it was pragmatic, because it was probably the only way to keep them both alive without destroying the kingdom. But it meant giving up the dream that had sustained her through centuries. Someone by her side, not as a secret visitor, but as a true partner in everything. They spent that last night together, not making love, but just holding each other. Hjordis memorized every detail of him. Ulfric whispered promises that they would find a way to make it work, that physical distance wouldn't change what they felt. But both knew they were comforting lies. Dawn arrived. The fields of judgment were even more packed than during the duel. Practically every giant in Jotunheim attending. The council was already positioned. Ancient expressions revealing nothing. The Supreme Elder Emir opened with a recitation of ancient laws. Then he got to the point. Hjordis had made a sacred promise that a surviving mortal would become king. Ulfric had survived. Technically, the promise should be honored, but allowing a mortal to rule giants would violate traditions that had sustained Jotnar society since primordial times. Different factions presented arguments for hours. Hjordis' supporters emphasized that oaths were sacred. Opponents argued that stability was worth more than a promise made in desperation. The debate threatened to last for days. It was Ulfric who broke the deadlock. Rising, he addressed the assembly with a voice carrying authority born from leadership in battle. "I don't seek to rule Jotunheim. I never sought a throne or power over others. I came to the realm following a call I didn't understand. I found something precious, and that is enough. I accept the title and lands offered, with no claim to the central throne." He paused, letting the words settle. But there's a difference between giving up voluntarily and being forced to bow from fear. Hjordis made a sacred promise, an oath that should be unbreakable among any honorable people. I release her from that promise of my own free will, not because she forces me or because the council demands it, but because I love her enough to choose her happiness over personal ambition. Let Jotunheim judge whether such an act is weakness or strength. His words fell like heavy snow, silencing debates. The Supreme Elder Emir studied Ulfric for a long moment, recognizing genuine sacrifice. Finally, he nodded. "I officially propose. Ulfric will receive the title of Lord of the Southern Lands, lands and resources to rule as he sees fit. Hjordis will remain absolute queen of Jotunheim. Their bond will be recognized but not officially sanctioned." It meant they could be together, but always in secret. It meant any child would be a bastard in the eyes of the law, with no right to succession. It meant choosing love in secret over public recognition. It was a bitter victory that tasted like defeat. Hjordis accepted with a voice barely controlling emotion. The council voted, majority approving from relief more than satisfaction. And so their fate was decided, not through great battle or heroic gesture, but through political pragmatism and painful concessions. Ulfric left for the southern lands 3 days later. Hjordis watched him leave from the top of her fortress, heart heavy. They had saved the kingdom but sacrificed her promise. She had kept power, but condemned them both to shared loneliness. But as Ulfric crossed the frozen plains, something beyond sadness grew within him. Determination. He would build something in the southern lands, something that would prove the union between mortal and giant wasn't weakness, but strength. And when Hjordis visited him, she would have not just a lover, but a true partner building a future no one had yet imagined possible. But 2 years later, Ulfric had transformed chaos into order through pure willpower. The southern lands were a wild region on the exact border between Jotunheim and Midgard, where the realms bled into each other in strange ways. Smaller portals opened and closed randomly, bringing creatures and people from both worlds. He had built a fortress of stone and wood in Norse style, but incorporating giant techniques that made the structure resistant. Around it had grown a settlement of almost 1,000 inhabitants, a bizarre mixture of mortals who had crossed from Midgard seeking new life, and marginalized giants who didn't fit into Jotunheim's rigid society. The law was simple. Strength and competence mattered, not origin or size. Mortals who proved their worth were respected equally to giants. Giants who caused trouble were punished with equal severity. Initially, there had been constant conflicts, but Ulfric established order through personal example, challenging and defeating the most troublesome in combat. The settlement prospered. Mortals brought knowledge of agriculture, metallurgy, and trade. Giants offered brute strength and cold resistance. Together, they created something unique, a synthesis of two cultures that shouldn't work, but did because it had no choice. Hjordis visited when she could, always at night, always in secret, even though everyone knew. These visits were precious moments where she could be something beyond queen. In Ulfric's arms, she found peace the throne never offered. And he, in her touch, found purpose violence never provided. But every farewell tore pieces from their souls. It was during the 7th visit, 8 months after he left, that Hjordis realized something was different. Morning nausea, increased sensitivity, small changes that alone wouldn't mean anything. But together, she consulted an old healer in the settlement. The confirmation came in words whispered with reverence and fear. "Majesty, you are pregnant." The news should have been impossible. Giants and mortals didn't produce offspring. The races were fundamentally incompatible. But something in their union, in the transformation both experienced that first impossible night, had created possibility where none should exist. Life grew within her, a hybrid of ice and mortal fire with no name or precedent in the history of the 9 realms. Ulfric reacted with a mixture of terror and joy. A child was a gift beyond any dream, but it was also a terrible vulnerability, a perfect target for enemies and living proof of a union the council had tried to minimize. Would the hybrid be strong as a giant, or fragile as a mortal? Would it inherit the mother's uncontrollable cold, or the father's resistance? They decided to keep the secret as long as possible. Hjordis stopped visiting publicly, claiming need to consolidate power. But she came secretly through smaller portals, spending months in the southern lands disguised by magic that temporarily reduced her size. The pregnancy lasted 14 months, not 9 like mortals, nor 20 like giants, but something intermediate. Hjordis grew in strange ways, her body struggling to accommodate a child that was part of 2 incompatible species. Pain was constant in the last months, but she refused to complain. When labor began, it was catastrophic. It lasted 3 full days of agony, Hjordis alternating between absolute cold that froze everything around and fever that melted ice. Healers worked desperately, using all the magic they knew to keep her alive. Ulfric held her hand through everything, letting her hurt him when she needed to release pain, whispering promises that she would survive because he couldn't lose her now. The child was born at dawn on the 4th day, small compared to a giant newborn but large for a mortal baby. It was a girl, and when her first cry echoed through the chamber, half the room froze instantly. Everyone retreated in fear, but Ulfric advanced. He took his daughter, felt the cold emanating from her, and smiled. She was exactly like her mother, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. "Skadi," he said, naming her in honor of the giant goddess who chose her own destiny. But the joy was short-lived. There was no way to hide pregnancy and birth from spies. News reached the council in weeks, and the reaction was immediate and brutal. They summoned Hjordis back to Jotunheim, not as a request, but as an order she couldn't ignore. When she appeared, still weak but refusing to show vulnerability, she found the council united in fury. The Supreme Elder Emir declared that the hybrid child was an abomination against nature, a violation of the laws that separated species for a reason. Its existence was an insult to the purity of the Jotnar race and a threat to order. They demanded Hjordis choose immediately, the throne or the child. If she chose to remain queen, the child would be permanently exiled to Midgard where it belonged. If she chose the child, she must renounce and never return. Hjordis felt her world crumbling. 1,000 years she had ruled Jotunheim, sacrificed everything for her people, and now they demanded she abandon her daughter or abandon the kingdom. She looked at the ancient faces of the council and saw they wouldn't yield. They were creatures of absolute tradition, incapable of accepting the fundamental change Skadi represented. The decision came faster than she expected, born of sudden clarity. She had ruled in loneliness for centuries, sacrificed happiness for duty countless times. But having a daughter, having family, this was precious in a way power never could be. She told the council she chose Skadi, that she voluntarily renounced the throne without reservations. The silence that followed was absolute. No one had expected her to actually do this. Hjordis removed the black ice crown she had worn for 1,000 years and placed it at the foot of the throne. Then she spoke for the last time as queen, voice carried by magic ensuring every Jotnar heard throughout the realm. I ruled alone for 1,000 years, sacrificed everything for the good of a people who never accepted me. But I found something more valuable than power in a mortal who defied the impossible for me, in a daughter who represents a future no one dared imagine. If Jotunheim cannot accept this, if tradition matters more than its queen's happiness, then let them have their kingdom. I have family now, and that is worth more than 1,000 thrones. She left Jotunheim that same day, crossing the portals to the southern lands where Ulfric waited with Skadi. When she arrived, no longer queen, but simply Hjordis, he embraced her with strength that took her breath away. He didn't say he was sorry, because they weren't. He didn't say it was worth it, because it was obvious. He just whispered, "We are family now, and we will build something that will be remembered long after kingdoms fall and gods die." Then Berserker. Epilogue. 20 years later. The following years were the happiest Hjordis had experienced in millennia. The southern lands grew into a prosperous settlement of almost 5,000 inhabitants, a place where mortal and giant lived side by side in precarious but genuine peace. Skadi grew fast, larger than mortal children, but smaller than giant babies, her body finding balance between impossible inheritances. Her ice power was intense but controllable, nothing like her mother's uncontrollable curse. At 10, she already trained with a sword. At 15, she defeated experienced warriors. At 20, she was a legend in her own right. Ulfric became not just a ruler, but a symbol of possibility for exiles and misfits from two realms. He proved a mortal could thrive in Jotunheim, that a giant could flourish under mortal leadership when respect was mutual. Other hybrids were born over the years, unions between mortal and giant that were once impossible, but that their existence had made feasible. Each found a home in the southern lands. Hjordis never regretted the choice, even when news came from Jotunheim of growing instability. The council quarreled over succession, factions formed and broke. Some whispered they might have made a mistake forcing the best queen they'd ever had to leave. But it was no longer her problem. She had Ulfric, she had Skadi, she had purpose in building something new instead of preserving something old. 20 years after their first impossible night together, Hjordis and Ulfric stood atop the fortress they had built, watching the weak sun paint the snow in shades of orange and purple. Ulfric was aging now, finally. Hair whitened, wrinkles formed around his eyes. Hjordis remained eternally young, but she didn't mind the difference. Skadi was below in the courtyard, now a young woman of strength and beauty that stopped hearts, training with sword against opponents both mortal and giant. She didn't belong completely to either world. And perhaps that was exactly what both needed. Ulfric took Hjordis' hand, fingers intertwining naturally after years of practice. Her cold no longer hurt him, or perhaps he had simply learned to love the pain that came with touching her. "No regrets," he said. "If I could go back and do everything differently, I would make exactly the same choices." She silently agreed, head resting on his shoulder. They knew their story wasn't complete. News came from Midgard of other portals opening, of more mortals crossing seeking legends about the warrior who conquered the Ice Queen. And from Jotunheim came rumors of young giants tired of old traditions, speaking of the southern lands as a place of possibilities. The world was changing, slowly but inexorably, and they had planted the seeds of that change. Hjördis knew the cost had been high. She had lost a kingdom, power, position she had fought centuries to conquer. Ulfric had sacrificed his mortal years in a strange land, aging while she remained eternal. Skadi would grow always divided, never completely accepted by either race that created her. It wasn't the happily ever after of tales sung by skalds. No perfect glory or unblemished victory. But it was real. It was theirs. As they watched their daughter below, strong and confident in ways neither had been allowed to be in their youths, Hjördis finally spoke. Was it worth it? All the suffering and sacrifice, all the impossible choices and prices paid? Ulfric turned to face her, eyes still clear despite his age, and smiled with the same fierce smile he'd given when accepting her challenge 20 years ago. "I survived the night in your bed as you challenged, but more than that, I survived every night since, and I will survive every future night until death claims me. I became king not of Jotunheim, but of something better. A family I chose, a community I built, a legacy that will live long beyond me. If that isn't victory, then victory isn't worth achieving." Hjördis kissed him, feeling his mortal warmth against her eternal ice, the balance they had learned to maintain through years of practice and love, as stubborn as winter's cold. Below, Skadi looked up and saw her parents. She smiled, then returned to training. She had work to do. Preparing for the day, she would inherit responsibility to prove hybrids weren't abominations, but evolution. In realms beyond, the gods watched with interest. Odin on his throne smiled with his single eye, recognizing the chaos he had planted by marking that warrior so many years ago. The Norns wove new threads of destiny, intertwining mortal red with giant ice blue, creating patterns that had never existed before. And in Jotunheim, young giants whispered about the queen who chose love over power, planting seeds of rebellion that would flower in future generations. The story of the Berserker Warrior and the Ice Queen didn't end with a perfectly happy ending. It ended with difficult choices, permanent sacrifices, and prices paid in loneliness and abandoned power. But it also ended with family built against all odds, with love that survived the impossible, with a legacy that would change two realms forever. And perhaps, in the end, that was the only victory that truly mattered. Hjördis and Ulfric remained atop the fortress as the sun set completely, transforming the sky into an explosion of impossible colors. When darkness fell, bringing the absolute cold of Jotunheim's night, they descended together to the warmth of their hall. There, surrounded by chosen friends and family, mortals and giants sharing mead and stories, they found something no throne ever provided. They found home. And in the years to come, when Ulfric finally aged beyond what even ice could delay, when his hands trembled and strength failed, Hjördis would be by his side. She would hold his hands as the cold finally reclaimed him, not to kill him, but to preserve him, transforming him into something between life and death that could remain with her longer than mortality normally allowed. It wasn't true immortality, but it was time stolen from destiny, and they would take every moment they could. And Skadi would grow to become her own legend, the hybrid who would unite two realms eventually, but only after her own battles and sacrifices mirroring her parents. Because legacies weren't easily won, and true change always cost blood, sweat, and tears frozen in Jotunheim's eternal ice. But that was a story for another night, another tale to be sung by skalds yet unborn. For now, in that moment stolen from destiny, Hjördis and Ulfric simply were. And that was enough.